great to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be in Austin and to be able to talk this morning about something that is very important to me and something obviously that's important to you, and that is the issue of the sanctity of human life. The title of my talk is Ideas Have Consequences, Reason Matters, and People Die. We're going to do, I'm a philosophy professor, so we're going to be doing a little bit of philosophy. I'm also going to tell a few stories in order to illustrate some of the issues that I'm going to raise in this lecture. But what I want to really focus on, and you'll see as we go through the three different principles, and that is, what is the sanctity of life really about? What is sort of the fundamental question, the kernel of truth that is the foundation of the idea of the sanctity of human life? I think it's about one fundamental question, and the fundamental question is this: who and what are we, and can we know it? Who and what are we, and can we know it? The theme for this conference is do no harm, which has its roots in the words of Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician from which we get the Hippocratic Oath. But the command, do no harm, only makes sense if we know to whom it is directed. So let me give you an illustration of what that means. I have a friend, Greg Koukl. Some of you may have heard of Greg Koukl. He is the founder and president of the evangelical ministry Stand to Reason. And he uses this example, which is, I think, quite good. He says, imagine you're sitting at a window with your back to the room, and you have a 7-year-old daughter, and she asks the question, "Daddy, can I kill it?" What's the next question you would immediately, what would be your response? What is it? Is it a fly or your little brother? In other words, the question of do no harm depends on the other question. To whom is it directed? The question often gets obscured when we debate and discuss issues concerning the sanctity of life. So let me give you some examples. Several years ago, I was invited to be on a panel, actually not on a panel, I was invited to be on a radio program that was hosted by the Iowa State University. Iowa State, what are they, the Cyclones? Is that Iowa, isn't that a weird name for a mascot, Cyclone? It's like, it's a natural disaster. It's like, like the plague. So imagine if, so what happened is I'm on this radio show, and I was on it to talk about a book that I had published nearly 30 years ago now called Politically Correct Death, Answering the Arguments for Abortion Rights. This was sort of pre-internet as we know it today, and so in order to promote a book, you did a lot of radio and television, and you didn't have blogs or social media or anything of that sort. So I'm on the show, and the host of the show had in the studio with him the local director of Planned Parenthood, and he didn't tell me that. I was on the phone at home. He had in the studio as the other guest this woman who was, as I said, the director of Planned Parenthood, and he began by asking her to comment about my book, and the first thing she said was, "I don't understand how you can write something on the issue of abortion. You're a man. You can't get pregnant." Now, of course, things have changed since then. I mean, right? I mean, in terms of the culture, right? But at the time, everyone just believed the obvious. And so remember, I'm sitting at home in my pajamas, and I asked her how she knew I was a man. She says, "Well, you have a deep voice." Well, I said, "So does Brenda Vaccaro." She's not a man. You guys don't remember Brenda Vaccaro. My point, she kept on sort of going back to this, you don't have a right to author a book or to in any way comment on the issue of abortion because you can't get pregnant. And eventually I said, well, what if you didn't know whether I was a man? What if you were walking through a bookstore and you saw my book, and after all, my name is Francis, and that is a girl's name. And I said, well, how would you assess the quality of my arguments? And she said, and she had nothing to say. I said, look, the issue here is, what is the scope of the human community? Does it in fact include unborn children or not? Whether I say it or you say it doesn't matter. What matters is the truth of what we're saying. And that is a question of presenting reasons as to why we think the way we do. So what you find today, as far back as today, meaning all the way back since the very beginning of the abortion debate, or on any other topic just dealing with the sanctity of human life, are ways to kind of avoid the central question. The central question is, who and what are we, and can we know it? I'll give you one other encounter. This was about 20, 30 years ago when my wife, whose name is Frankie, by the way, I think mentioned it to the woman on the radio. I said, my spouse is named Frankie and I'm Francis, so who knows, right? So this was when my wife was the manager of the Las Vegas Athletic Club in Las Vegas. And at the time, there was a petition that was to put on the ballot in Nevada a referendum in order to make Roe v. Wade, which was a Supreme Court decision, the law of Nevada, just in case Roe v. Wade were to be overturned. And so one of the clients of the club came up to my wife and said, sign this petition because it will put on the ballot a vote on abortion. And my wife, who is pro-life, said, well, I'm not sure I should sign it. And she goes, oh, it'll give you a chance for your view to be heard. So when I went in to work out, my wife showed me what she had signed. I said, well, that person was not telling you the truth. I didn't know that she was actually standing right next to me. And so we got into an argument. And so we were debating abortion right there in the Las Vegas Athletic Club. And so I forget her name. She says to me, and I was giving my arguments as to why I believe that the unborn are human beings and why they should be protected by the law. And she said, well, what about cases of rape and incest? How would you deal with that? A young woman becomes pregnant as a consequence of a violent act or as a result of the fact that she's a minor and she cannot consent. And I asked her immediately, well, what if there were no cases of rape or incest? Would you still be for abortion rights? She paused for a moment. She said, I would still be for it. I said, well, then cases of rape and incest are irrelevant to your case. What's really relevant to your case is whether, in fact, those unborn children are full-fledged members of the human community. I agree with you that those are very, very difficult cases. But for you, they're actually not difficult cases because you don't believe unborn human beings are deserving of protection, whether they're the consequence of consent or coercion. And so the real issue is, who and what are we, and can we know it? And once we settle that question, we can move on to the difficult ones. My point of telling you this story is that this was an instance, and many of you can probably tell your own story of discussing abortion or other sanctity of life issues where the central question is either avoided, ignored, or pushed aside. And so what I want to focus on today is how we sort of think about getting people to look more closely at that central question. pardon me. So, this question often gets obscured in the modern world, and we need to kind of help people draw them out. What sort of tactics can we use to sort of help people see this? And so let me go back to those three initial fundamental truths. Ideas have consequences, reason matters, people die. So I'm going to go over each one of those and help you to sort of think through how to do this, how to draw out from people, how to get them to see the central question. So first, ideas have consequences. What does that mean? It means that whatever people believe about sort of fundamental issues of human life, what they believe about the world in general, makes a difference in how they in fact interpret and view the world, our fellow human beings, and ourselves. Let me give you a couple examples. One is a kind of fanciful example. This is actually an illustration that one of my former professors gave to me, nearly 40 years ago now. So imagine you have a relative who believes that he's dead, but he's not dead. So you take him to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist sits him down and he says, look, you're not dead, you're alive, and the relative of yours demands proof. So the psychiatrist says, look, if I can prove to you that dead men do not bleed, will you change your mind? He says, yes, I will. So he shows him all these books on physiology, on anatomy, on blood circulation. And the guy says, okay, you've convinced me. But then when he's not looking, the doctor sticks him with a pin in his arm. And your relative looks down and he's got an ashen look on his face, and he sees the blood trickling, and he says, my God, dead men do bleed after all. What you believe, in many ways, in fact, in most ways, affects the way you interpret the world. And so to sort of draw people out, you have to understand the ideas that they already accept and go for those. So one other illustration, I'm going to read to you two quotes. One is from a very famous doctor, a physician who passed away not too long ago, and a defender of euthanasia, that is, defender of what sort of is sometimes called mercy killing, that is, the view that it is permissible for physicians to intentionally kill patients who are suffering from particular types of ailments. A version underneath that is sometimes called physician-assisted suicide. It's kind of species of euthanasia. The other is a quote from a philosopher, a German philosopher from the early 20th century who had a profound influence on the German euthanasia movement. So I'm going to read one of them. The first is, the ugly name helping to die, which is showing up in recent writings, is ambiguous. Pain control measures which do not alter the illness's actual cause of death must not be considered here. The only important case for us to consider is replacing a death which is painful, rooted in the disease, and possibly longer lasting, with a less painful alternative. For example, a patient suffering terribly from cancer of the tongue receives a fatal morphine injection from a physician or other health professional, an injection which causes a painless death, either more quickly or perhaps a little more slowly. And here's the other quote. The time has come for a courageous redefinition of terms. To be sure, euthanasia means good death, good in a concrete way for the subject concerned, and in an abstract sense for family and friends. But is that good enough? Such a death will entail complete negativity, no matter how serene. It serves no constructive or positive purpose beyond the bleak aim of extinguishing life. An immense amount of inherent good is thereby senselessly squandered. The aim should extend far beyond a mere good death toward a superlative ideal, which technically might be called Eutatis Thanasia, or best death, unquote. Which one is the contemporary physician and which one is the paleo-Nazi? Can you really tell the difference? I mean, both what they're both recognizing is that rhetorically we have to change the way in which we talk about intentional killing of human beings that are innocent. My point is, and I'm not saying that the contemporary physician who I quoted is a Nazi. I'm not sort of engaging in the kind of reductio ad Hitlerum fallacy. What I'm suggesting is that ideas that may seem to be at the time extremely attractive because they seem to be motivated by noble ends may in fact have tragic consequences. By the way, the physician who I quoted second was Jack Kevorkian, who was the infamous Dr. Death, who I think died about almost a decade ago now. And the first was a quote from Professor Carl Binding, Professor Doctor of Law and Philosophy, who wrote an article called Permitting the Destruction of Unworthy Life, which had a deep and profound influence on the trajectory of German ethics and eventually comes to fruition under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, not too soon after that. One more example of ideas having consequences. Here I'm going to quote from a friend of mine with whom I have deep disagreements. His name is David Boonin. He's a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. David and I have actually worked together on philosophical projects. 5 years ago, I was a visiting professor at the University of Colorado. David published a book in 2002 called A Defense of Abortion. I published a book by the same publisher, Cambridge University Press, 5 years later called Defending Life. I think David is deeply mistaken about abortion, but he's nevertheless a friend. And David, in the beginning of his book, A Defense of Abortion, begins with, in the introduction or the preface to the book, says this: on the desk in my office, where most of this book was written and revised, there are several pictures of my son Eli. In one, he is gleefully dancing on the sand along the Gulf of Mexico, the cool ocean breeze wreaking havoc with his wispy hair. In the top drawer of my desk, I keep another picture of Eli. The picture was taken September 7th, 1993, 24 weeks before he was born. The sonogram image is murky, but it reveals clearly enough a small head tilted back slightly and an arm raised and bent, with the hand pointing back toward the face and the thumb extended toward the mouth. There is no doubt in my mind that this picture, too, shows the same little boy at the very early stage in his physical development. And there is no question that the position I defend in this book entails that it would have been morally permissible to end his life at this point. Unquote. Did you hear that? So what David is saying is that I have this picture of my son, sonogram photo. What you see in there is the same Eli that the one who is now nearly 30 years old, or 28. I saw him on Facebook. I almost asked to be his friend not too long ago. But what he's saying is that what I'm defending in this book is that it would be okay for his mother to have terminated his life at the time at which that sonogram was taken. I mean, I think that David is completely wrong. It actually takes a lot of guts to actually write that down and put that in the book. But why does David hold that view? Why does he believe that that's permissible? Because he doesn't deny that Eli was a human being during that development. And I'll have some more to say about that in a few minutes when we talk about reason matters. But my point of reading that quote is to show you how profound ideas, the profundity that ideas can play on the development of a person's intellectual life, as well as what they believe about other human beings, including their own children. So let's move on to reason matters. So those were illustrations of ideas of consequences. Reason matters. So we can employ our rational powers that God has given us in order to clarify and explain the pro-life view to our fellow citizens on whose hearts the natural law is written. Reason, by the way, is just not a matter, when you hear the word reason, I don't know if any of you have seen Star Trek or are Star Trek fans. There's the character of Spock, right? And he is logic to a fault. And oftentimes when people think about reason and reasoning, they think of Spock or some sort of like detached, almost to a fault, logical individual. But that's not what reason that's not what rationality or reason is in terms of the way in which we engage other people. It's not mere calculation and dry argument. It's a matter of persuasive engagement. It's appealing to what other people already know, but don't know they know. So let me give you an illustration of this. So my first job in the academy was, actually my first real job was being a busboy at the Stardust Hotel in Las Vegas in 1974 when the mob ran it. So I got good tips. So my first job after earning my PhD was at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where I grew up in Vegas. I taught in the philosophy department, and I taught several courses dealing with ethics. And in one course, I had a student, a young woman who was a terrific student. She was the kind of student that spoke up in class, would challenge me, but challenge me in a way that was respectful and resulted in the kind of conversations that professors love having in the classroom. So one day she raises her hand. We're talking about, at the time, the question of what is called relativism, the idea that there is no actual objective moral truth or any truth whatsoever. So she raises her hand and she asks me the question, why is the truth important? And I answered, do you want the true answer or the false one? So to ask the question, is the truth important, presupposes that you know it already. In other words, the very inquiry, when you ask somebody, why is the truth important? You're only asking because you believe the truth is important. Right? So a lot of the things we're going to be going over in the next few minutes are appeals to things that I believe, and most ordinary people believe, is true, but they just don't think about it. It's not conspicuously present to their minds. Another example. Let me give you some other illustrations concerning the sanctity of human life. And another thing to remember here is that because people are oftentimes moved by emotion and rarely by reason, we need to employ our rational powers in a way that draws out what they already know. So if, let's say, when that young woman in my class said, why is the truth important? I could have gone into Spock mode, right? I could have gone and go, well, that's a self-refuting claim. You can't ask whether the truth is important unless you already believe the truth is important. Ha ha. I could have done that, right? But that's not effective, right? What's effective is being rhetorically artful, that is drawing it out in a way that gets people to see what they already know. So a couple of examples. So back in the early 90s, when I was living in Las Vegas and was a professor at UNLV, I was also really involved with politics. And I was the chair of the platform committee of one of the two major parties in Nevada. I won't mention it to you because I don't want to sound partisan. So my job was to help formulate, put together the party platform. And so there was a section of the platform for the state convention. So part of the platform involved the issue of abortion. And the party was mostly pro-life, but there was a large contingency in the party that was that was for abortion rights. They supported Roe v. Wade. And so when we were putting together the platform, I had to look at all the pieces of paper that were given to the committee by all the precinct leaders that had collected the opinions of all the people that had attended the precinct meetings about what they wanted in the platform for the party. So when we got to the point of the place on the platform concerning abortion, this is the language I formulated. It went something like this. The blank party in Nevada affirms the right of a woman to terminate her pregnancy if and only if it does not result in the death of her unborn child. So let me repeat that again. The blank party of Nevada affirms a woman's right to terminate her pregnancy if and only if it does not result in the death of her unborn child. I had people on the panel or on the committee who were pro-lifers who said, you can't say it that way. And I said, no, here's why. There's going to be debate at the convention, and this will rhetorically force the other side to actually deal with the question of who, in fact, dies in an abortion. Because if you frame it as simply, we are against abortion, rather than focusing on what is in fact the end of abortion or the purpose of it, and get us to have a conversation about who and what we are and whether we can know it, you're not going to be able to, I guess, get very far. So during the portion of the convention in which the debate occurred, the way it happened then in the early 90s, and I don't know if it happens this way today, there were two microphones on each side, and I said, those that, as a point of order, discussion, and one side were the people that opposed it, and one side was the people that supported it. And the first person that spoke against it said, I disagree with it. And I read it. I said, we affirm the right to a woman's right to terminate her pregnancy if and only if it does not result in the death of her unborn child. I said, what part don't you agree with? And he said, the second part. I said, so you want us to say that we affirm the right to terminate the life of the unborn child? And he said, well, I wouldn't put it that way. And it was clear that the way in which we framed it created such an uneasiness because on the other side, because they had to actually wrestle with this question. So I don't think I convinced any of them to change their minds, but the point was to get them to see by using kind of a rhetorical artfulness to sort of draw those reasons out. Another example, I mentioned my friend Greg Kokel earlier. One of the things that Greg, I think, is very gifted at is being able to sort of get to the bottom of a particular issue. And so if you look at the ways in which people defend abortion today, at least in the popular culture, there will always be appeals to things like poverty, that an unplanned pregnancy can interfere with, let's say, the career aspirations of the pregnant woman, There's also the specter of illegal abortions, that if abortion becomes illegal, then women will seek illegal abortions, which are dangerous. If you look at each one of those arguments, those popular arguments, they don't make any sense if you apply the same reasoning to postnatal children. That is, supposing we were to take the poverty example. If let's say somebody says, well, if we don't permit families to terminate the lives of 5-year-olds, then that will cost them more money. And people would be aghast and horrified by that kind of argument, right? Why? Because they see 5-year-olds rightfully as full-fledged members of the human community. And so the question then is the unborn human being as much a human being, as much a member of the human community as a postnatal individual? And as Greg puts it, if the unborn child is not a person, then the popular arguments are irrelevant. Then if in fact the unborn human being is not one of us, then appealing to poverty or difficult life or illegal abortions is irrelevant. Why would you want, in other words, just argue that the unborn human being is not one of us? Those other factors don't matter, right? On the other hand, if in fact the unborn human being is in fact one of us, a person, then none of those arguments are relevant as well, right? So in the first case, they're not necessary. In the second case, they're not relevant. So that gets us to the core issue. So one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that when we apply our rational powers with these popular arguments, always ask yourself, can we apply the same reasoning to postnatal children? And if you can't, then you should draw your interlocutor's attention to that, right? And point out then the real issue is who and what are we and can we know it? Is the unborn human being one of us? So I want to now continue with this theme of reason and explain to you why my friend David Boonin holds the views that he does. And so here we're gonna discuss a little philosophy. Now, we've already talked, I guess, a little philosophy. Philosophers like to argue and talk about arguments and evaluating them. But here I want to kind of go over why is it that people like David Boonin and other philosophers and a lot of other really informed people do not accept the sanctity of human life, or at least reject the idea that unborn human beings are one of us. And there's two types of arguments they offer. And the first one has to do with something that some of you may have heard of before, and that is they make a distinction between being a human being and being a person. So they argue that all fetuses, all unborn human beings are in fact human beings, but they're not persons. Well, what do they think persons are? Well, they think persons are any organism, human being or Vulcan or Klingon or anybody else that happens to have certain characteristics, the ability to reason, to think through complex problems, to have a self-concept, the things we typically associate with mature human beings. And they say, well, the fetus lacks those, the unborn human beings lacks those, therefore they're not persons. They don't have quote unquote moral status. Now, what's wrong with that as an argument? Now, there are lots of ways that we can respond to it, but I want to kind of draw your attention to one of I think the deepest problem with this view. It confuses what we are with what we do. That is, these powers that our ability to reason, the idea of having a self-concept, the ability to solve complex problems, all those are mature characteristics that human beings by their nature are ordered toward. That is, those are perfections of who we are, but they don't determine what we are. After all, human beings can suffer from disabilities, and they can lack those characteristics, even permanently. And yet we don't think that is a justification to, in fact, kill those human beings or to treat them in ways that are undignified and subhuman. So let me give you an example. Supposing you believe, you're not a vegan, supposing you believe it's okay to eat cows, right? We're in Texas, right? There's lots of longhorns, not the students at the University of Texas. By the way, you can't actually find anything orange in Waco or burnt orange. It's a joke. It's an anti-Longhorn joke, which would not go well. So supposing you believe it's perfect, you're not a vegan, you think it's perfectly okay to eat cattle. You like a good steak, a hamburger, so forth. And you believe that because you don't believe cows are persons. You don't believe that they are intrinsically valuable living organisms that are made in the image of God. You don't believe it's okay to torture them or treat them badly, but you think it's perfectly okay because we're carnivorous creatures for us to eat cattle. Now, on the other hand, supposing you take the view that some bioethicists hold that people that are in a permanent vegetative state are no longer persons. And supposing one of them is named Hans. Would it be okay to create a Hans burger? I know. By the way, I get this example from my friend Chris Kazer at the Loyola Marymount University. He's the one who came up with the very, distasteful pun. Hansburg, right? So you think, well, people would recoil with that. Why wouldn't it be okay to make a Hans burger if Hans is morally indistinguishable from the cow, right? Or imagine this. Imagine another example that Chris uses. Imagine you're driving and there is a woman walking her child across the crosswalk with a baby in a stroller. And then out jumps a dog, a German Shepherd, and you, in order for you to save the German Shepherd, you have to swerve to the right and hit the woman with the stroller, or the stroller, not her, but just the stroller. And supposing you hold David Boonen's view, or not David's view, but a view held by certain philosophers like Michael Tooley, that not even infants are persons, and who believe that dogs actually have a higher cognitive level than infants and therefore are more valuable, it would seem that you should swerve towards the stroller, right? And yet virtually everybody thinks no. Even if you were discovered, if that child in the stroller was suffering, let's say, from Down syndrome, you still wouldn't think it would be okay to swerve towards the stroller, right? Or another example. So imagine there was a mad scientist. We'll call him Hugh-genics. Hugh-genics? Okay. Now, I came up with that one. That's not a Chris Kazer one. So Hugh-genics, let's say Hugh-genics is a mad scientist, and he wants to be able to harvest organs of human beings because he realizes that he can sell them for quite a bit of money on the black market. And supposing he holds the view that David Boone and others hold, that human beings are only persons when they have these higher brain functions. So what he does is he creates in his laboratory these kind of artificial wombs in which he puts IVF embryos. They develop over time, but he stops their neural tubes from developing. So he creates essentially children that do not actually can never acquire their higher brain functions, right? So, and they develop into full-grown adults, like in suspended animation, and he simply takes their organs and sells them on the black market, right? Now, imagine there are a bunch of pro-life radicals catching wind of this, and they break into the laboratory of Dr. Hugh-genics, take all the embryos to their own laboratory, heal those embryos, and then place them in the wombs of women that want to adopt them, and those children develop normally and are born and are healthy. Were the embryos given justice Were they healed? That is to say, were the embryos given what justice demands? If you say yes, that means that you understand that human beings, even before they acquire these higher functions, can in fact be harmed. And that to actually make sure that they in fact develop normally, that they achieve their perfection, is in fact to treat them with justice. One other thing to say about this view. So we're going through it really quickly. I've written a whole book on not just this issue, but I have a whole chapter in it. It's a book called Defending Life. And then there's a book by Chris Kazor called The Ethics of Abortion, which also deals with these arguments. But one more thing to remember concerning this point of view is that to say that our value depends on these characteristics undermines the idea of human equality. These characteristics all come in degrees. So not all of us are equally rational. Not all of us have equal abilities, right? We're all different, right? Some of us have great athletic ability, some musical ability, some intellectual ability. Some of us are good at math. Some of us are more verbal. There's also, human beings are on there's a continuum of abilities. No two of us, even identical twins, have the same actual identical set of attributes that are associated with quote unquote personhood. But to say that that's what makes us intrinsically valuable, those abilities, ultimately means that we should have a kind of multi-tier view of rights, that the most intelligent and gifted should have more rights than people that are less intelligent and gifted. And that seems to smack at the same kind of discrimination that we've seen applied along the lines of racial discrimination throughout human history that we've tried the best we can to resist. In fact, if anything, if you look at the ways in which racial discrimination has been resisted, at least in the West, it's always been an appeal to this kind of idea of the imago Dei, that human beings are all made in the image of God. And if you look at least in the United States, the rise of the civil rights movement, it was largely the result of its success, I believe, was the result of a large segment of Christian ministers, African-American Christian ministers, who kind of shamed white America, saying you're not living consistently with your own Christian principles, right? So this appeal to this idea of equality having to do with not what we do, but who we are, our nature as human beings. Let me move on then to the second reason why David holds his view. And we're going to have to go through this quickly because I want to open up the floor for any questions you may have. David also holds the view that it doesn't matter if the unborn human being is a person, abortion is still justified. And that sounds kind of weird to our ears, I think. But there's an argument for this that David picks up and tries to renovate. It goes all the way back to 1971. There was an article published in the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs, authored by Judith Jarvis Thompson, who just recently actually passed away in November of 2020. She uses several analogies to pregnancy in order to show that abortion is in fact justified. In one of them, Thompson asks us to imagine that the society of music lovers has rendered you unconscious and abducted you so that a famous unconscious violinist who is suffering from a kidney ailment can use your kidneys for 9 months. Your kidnappers plug your circulatory system into this machine that is then plugged into the violinist. You wake up, the doctor says to you, look, the violinist is a person, he has a right to life. To unplug the violinist is to kill the violinist. So all you have to do is stay hooked up for 9 months. And Thompson says, it's obvious that you shouldn't feel obligated to be hooked up to 9 months. For 9 months, it's okay to unplug yourself from the violinist. So therefore, a woman who gets pregnant as a that she didn't intend, a pregnancy that she becomes pregnant not as the result of her intention, she should be able to unplug the fetus from her, even if the fetus is a person. Now, people can say that, well, that maybe only applies in extreme cases like rape. But Thompson has an answer for that. She said, she gives other illustrations. After all, is not a woman who consents, let's say, to sex, isn't she responsible, right? And for the existence of any person that arises from her decision. Not so fast, argues Thompson. She has another analogy. She says, if the room is stuffy and I therefore open a window to air it and a burglar climbs in, it would be absurd to say, now he can stay. She's given a right to use her house, for she is partially responsible for his presence there, having voluntarily done what enabled him to get in full knowledge that there are such things as burglars and that burglars burgle. Now, it's an obvious allusion to pregnancy resulting from failed contraception, or that has to do with, it doesn't matter whether there's contraception, but now she does actually bring up the issue of contraception, and she says she's got a story for that too. She says, imagine that the owner had put up mounted bars outside her window for the sole purpose of thwarting burglars, and that the only reason why one got through is that one of the bars was defective. Now suppose it's not a burglar who intentionally enters through an open or barred window, but just an ordinary person that just happens to stumble in. And it happens this way. She says, imagine there's such a thing as people seeds that are about in the air like pollen, and if you open your windows, one may drift in and take root in your carpets or upholstery. You don't want children, so you fix up your windows with fine mesh screens, the very best you can buy. As can happen, however, and on very rare occasions, it does happen, one of the screens is defective and a seed drifts in and takes root. Does the person plant who now develops have a right to use your house? Unquote. The answer, argues Thompson, is surely no. So what's wrong with this? I mean, I'm sure some of your minds are probably going, this is really weird. It is. There's lots of ways we can answer her. One real quick way, and I actually think the ways in which many of us have responded to her, I think, are quite adequate. But what I want to do is challenge the idea that you actually need an analogy to pregnancy to understand it. So there's some of the other ways that people respond are things like, what about deadbeat dads? Right? I mean, after all, for a woman to get pregnant, there has to be a male involved, right? And supposing, he says, look, I didn't intend for you to bring the child to term. Why should I have to pay child support, right? And yet every government in the United States, all 50 states, have no problem garnishing the wages of a delinquent father, right? Supposing he's a mechanic that works, uses his physical labor 40 hours a week, and 20% of which will go to a child, right, for 18 years, right? We have no problem with that, right? So I think the deadbeat dad response works. There's also the issue called the issue of attractive nuisance, which has to do with something called tort law. If you were, let's say, to leave your, let's say you had a pool in your backyard and you left the gate open and a small child wanders in and happens to drown, that's called an attractive nuisance, and you're responsible for that. So in a way, by engaging in voluntary intercourse, a person is to sort of say, welcoming, in a sense, a defenseless, vulnerable human being. But setting that aside, setting those criticisms aside, I think the deeper issue here, I think the deeper problem here is why the heck do we need an analogy to pregnancy to understand it? I mean, think about the ways we use analogies. People will sometimes say, or often say, that in Texas, football is like a religion. Nobody says that religion is like Texas football. Suppose someone were trying to explain to you the meaning of eating and drinking by telling you that they are sort of like receiving sustenance intravenously through tubes, except that you use your mouth, esophagus, and stomach. You would think that odd because you already know what eating and drinking are, and it is the artificial forms of nutrition and hydration that require the analogy of eating and drinking to understand and explain them. When a woman discovers she is pregnant, typically, though certainly not always, there's great joy. Nobody's first thought after hearing the news is, wow, poor girl, what's happened to her is tantamount to being hooked up to an unconscious violinist against her will for 9 months. Even in cases in which pregnancy is unplanned or unexpected, when, for example, there's a contraceptive failure, it is unlikely that the pregnant woman thinks to herself, wow, I imagine this is just what it's like would be like for a homeowner if people seeds were to drift into her upholstery and carpets. Or when I think about the implication of pregnancy and my relationship to my unborn child, I find it illuminating to consider the case of a pliable burglar sneaking through barred windows. Nobody thinks that way. The fact is that virtually everyone intuitively senses that parents have a special responsibility to their children, that we don't need an analogy in order to explain it. If anything, we use parenthood as an analogy to explain other things. So someone may say, my professor is like a father to me, or my Aunt Jane has been like a mother all my life. So it's weird to me that she tries to explain pregnancy by an analogy. Now, Thompson herself kind of deals with, she says at one point that we surely do not have any responsibility for a person unless we have assumed it explicitly or implicitly. So she basically says, until parents take the child home from the hospital, they don't have a responsibility. And I think that's complete madness for a couple of reasons. One, why is it the hospital that grants those two people the right to take those children home or that child home rather than some random parent? Right? It's because we connect those biological progenitors to that particular child, right? And think about it, if consent was the essence of what makes an obligation, then who gets to consent on behalf of the child? After all, that child is brought home by parents they didn't consent to be brought home to. That child is taught a language, lives under a set of laws, is taught a language, none of which they consent to. Right? It's because there's more to the obligations that we have to those closest to us and strangers that goes beyond just mere consent. So finally, tying this all together, people die. People die. So ideas have consequences, reason matters, and ultimately people die. Since 1973, abortion has resulted in the deaths of over 40 million unborn human beings. And I think it's contributed to a general diminishing of our respect for prenatal life, as all the other debates over the past 40, 50 years have shown us. But the reasoning that gave us abortion on demand ultimately undermines, in a weird way, the very basis for our liberal democracy, which is the idea of human equality. It leaves us, this kind of mentality, as isolated and atomistic individuals without a natural family to which we can go home and rely and for which we owe nothing in return for the order and love it gives to our lives. So when discussing these questions with friends and family, peers, protagonists, and antagonists, never forget those three truths. For the end of the day, the debate about the sanctity of life is about who and what we are and whether we can know it. The cultural conflict over the permissibility of abortion, as well as the permissibility of all sorts of other practices that violate the sanctity of human life is really a dispute over whether or not we are justified in extending our nation's progress toward the elimination of unjust discrimination to those who are the most vulnerable in the human family, the unborn, the severely disabled. It is, at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, a testimony to that inescapable truth that statecraft is soulcraft, that one cannot deny the command, do no harm, if one excludes from its scope those members of the human family who are small, defenseless, immature, dependent, and one of us. Thank you.
Let's hear that thunderous applause for Dr. Beckwith. Thank you so much for your time and expertise.
5 minutes left or so?
Yes, we actually have some questions that we want to ask you. I hope you're ready.
Okay.
We have some good ones. And if you have not submitted your question and you want to do that, open up that Boots on the Ground app. And when you click on the speakers tab, you'll see one of those speakers is someone named Q&A. Click on that little person, and that will bring up the field to submit your question. So let's see what we have here. First off, let's talk about whether you were raised to believe in the sanctity of life, or did you have an aha moment later on in life?
That's a great question. My parents were both very observant Catholics. I grew up in a household that was pro-life. My parents were never activists or anything like that. When I went off to college, although I'd gone through a kind of a spiritual journey. I actually grew up Catholic, left the Catholic Church, became an evangelical Protestant, then 15 years ago, returned to the Catholic Church. But during the time in college, I kind of became a kind of moderate on abortion. It wasn't until I was in graduate school at Fordham University in New York City when I got into an argument with a fellow doctoral student who was an atheist, who I was telling him about my views on abortion. And I said that I believed it was permissible in certain circumstances. And he said, "Well, that's inconsistent. If you believe that the unborn human being is a person, then you can't have exceptions like that." And so that actually was my aha moment. And it was a guy who turned out to be a pro-life atheist. So that was a kind of, it's unusual. And so that was the time where I sort of shifted my thinking. What also I think shifted my thinking was the kind of growing up in a house where my parents were kind of fairly liberal on a lot of issues, but very much the kind of folks like stood up for the little guy. That kind of thinking shifted my own political views, because as I got older and I saw that people that I considered to be my sort of political fellow travelers said they stood up for the little guy, but they were pro-abortion, I just thought that was sort of inconsistent. So that was a kind of aha moment for me.
So you talked about having that conversation with someone that you respected, that one-on-one personal conversation. There's a couple questions in here that kind of allude to this, but someone was asking about what advice do you have when trying to have a productive discourse with someone who doesn't want to have a reasonable civil discussion, or with the way things are on social media. You know, you post something that's maybe politically charged on Facebook and the comments are just a war zone. So how do you navigate those situations, and can social media even be a productive platform for these kind of discussions?
So it's like asking, how can I navigate the hurricane? Well, don't get in the boat, right? So that's one way. So so I actually, starting the beginning of the year, I actually got off social media.
Good for you.
Well, but I had, not so much. Facebook's not as bad, but I'm on Twitter, and I think I had like 7,000 followers, which isn't really, in terms of, popularity generally, it's not a lot. And what bothered me more than anything is I would read things that people would say that I wouldn't like, and I knew I would have this moment where I type something and I would just not hit the return, thinking if I hit this, I am in for some trouble. Because I have some of the best one-liners you've never heard. That I thought I could say. There's one I can't share with you that I deleted like a second later and nobody saw it. And I shared it privately with people, and they go, "Oh my gosh, that's great! That would have made you that would have made you a social media star." Yeah, but it would have ruined my career. So I'll give you one though. So one time, and I got 10,000 retweets on this. I had is it Amy Schumer, the comedian? She sent out an ad for her new act, and she said that she was suffering from Comedy 19, and I retweeted it, and I said, "Yeah, but you're unsymptomatic." And that was like boom, and that was a good one. So yeah, I think it just terms of navigating. I think you always have to remember that it's not always the person you're responding to, but the people viewing you, and so you have to restrain yourself from being too snarky. And also, sometimes it's just good not to do anything. I mean, I got to tell you, since stopping, I think January 4th or 5th, I got on and I said, I'm off for 2022. I've had more peace of mind. I mean, I told my wife that I actually am happy. Like, this is weird. Like, is it going to wear off? You know, it's really weird. You don't understand how that stuff is like, joy sucking. So that's my.
No one's making you join the fight, right?
So, what?
No one's making you join the fight. You can just walk away from it.
Yeah.
We have time for just one more question. There's a lot of questions in here, so I encourage you to go to Dr. Beckwith's website. It's francisbeckwith.com.
That's right.
Is that correct? Okay, so go to his website if you have questions you don't get to address today. One more. Someone asked, why do you use the term part of the human community, and what's the significance of that? We heard that a few times in the speech.
It's a rhetorical thing because the kind of language that people use in the abortion debate, you'll typically, you hear people on the pro-abortion side saying it's just a fetus, right? And pro-lifers will say it's a baby, right? And I think I want to kind of get out of that rhetorical gamesmanship and just say the human community. And I think that's a way of just expressing it where it puts the other person with whom I disagree in a position of saying, no, the unborn child is not part of the human community, which is not a popular way of advancing that point of view. So it's a way to do it that's not harsh, but it's also challenging.
Sure. Big round of applause for Dr. Beckwith. Thank you for your time and expertise today.